They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Over the past 2 decades, no monster has been as ubiquitous as the zombie. The Walking Dead reign over the horror genre. Zombie films, zombie television, zombie games, zombie literature, the risen dead are everywhere. And while we may be at the end of the current zombie horror cycle, the thing about the dead is, they rise from the grave, and there seems to be limitless numbers of them. The same goes for the films. Zombie cinema is here to stay, here to rule, and it is practically unkillable as a genre. But how did it become so popular, so dominant? Let's start at the middle. Commercial and industrial film director George Romero made a low-budget horror film in Pittsburgh. It was called Night of the Living Dead, and it changed everything. The independently released film made a killing at the box office, and its stark, brutal narrative caught the attention of horror fans everywhere. The story concerns a group of survivors stranded at a farmhouse. Outside the walls, the dead have risen, and they want to consume the flesh of the living. Inside this microcosm, the group fractures, the resentments and differing personalities clashing, working against their odds of survival. This narrative beat captured the imagination of audiences everywhere, and it did it at the right time. The 1960s were an era of political and societal upheaval, a significant change from the past decade, the post-war era of the 1950s, where social conformity was expected and demanded. This did not happen in Night of the Living Dead. Instead, we get the excellent Dwayne Jones, and this choice as lead is significant. In this world of the dead, of the corpses rising to consume the living, the social order has broken down. A black man can be the protagonist, the one we follow, the one we care most about. This was a radical thing. Practically no genre films featured black heroes. Personally, I can think of only one significant genre film where this was the case. Harry Belafonte starred in the post-apocalyptic The World, the Flesh and the Devil in 1959. The film follows, seemingly, the last man on Earth, and the first half hour is great. But then, when he meets 2 others, the film nosedives into outdated racial politics, and despite good intentions, it dates the film badly. Romero's Night of the Living Dead is not dated, possibly because Romero's statement on race in America was accidental. According to the director, he didn't hire Dwayne Jones because he was black. He hired him because he was the best actor for the job, which is admirable. Yet this happy accident gives the film a further social dimension, one that was significant on many levels. First off, the zombie genre was, as covered in my previous episode, Rise of the Dead, a genre built on Haitian lore and on the brutal history of the slave trade. Black performers were in these films zombies, mysterious voodoo priests, or comedic reliefs. But they were never in charge, unlike Dwayne Jones.
Now, you get the hell down in the cellar. You can be the boss down there. I'm boss up here.
Secondly, the casting of Dwayne Jones perfectly aligned to the zeitgeist, with a world in social upheaval. For Romero's film isn't merely a monster movie, but also a thoughtful distillation of societal fears, which is true of most horror cinema with generational staying power. And boy does Night of the Living Dead have staying power. Its influence remains significant, and we can't possibly cover every film that followed in its wake. There are just too many. So let's look at a few key examples, and apologies if I ignore your personal zombie favorite. It makes sense to start with Romero's influence on himself. One significant consequence of Night of the Living Dead was Romero's continuing career as filmmaker. He has done several non-zombie films, like the artsy vampire film Martin, the motorcycle night movie Night Riders, and Stephen King adaptations like The Dark Half. but his most popular films were his zombie movies. Dawn of the Dead is perhaps the masterpiece of Romero's career. Led by Ken Foree, a group of survivors try to endure the zombie apocalypse in that most American of all places, the mall. The film remained low budget, but was another gigantic financial success for George Romero. Its obvious satirical edge stimulated a thinking and clever horror audience, and the film said much about 1970s consumerism, predicting further trends of materialism that would develop in the 1980s. There's rarely been a more direct metaphor than unthinking zombies shuffling through a mall, the brain-dead consumers trapped in a system, unsustainably gnawing at what remains of a decadent, collapsing society. Day of the Dead followed in 1985, right in the middle of Reaganism. This time Romero put the action at an underground base, where soldiers and researchers survive together. They capture zombies for testing, and discover something troubling about one of their subjects. The military-industrial complex is corrupt, represented by an aggressive and unthinkingly brutal leader, another Romero takedown of American policy. But most significant is his victim, a sentient zombie, no longer just a mindless creature destroying all in his wake, but a monster with the capacity for emotion. This was another challenge to the audience. What if things are more complicated than they seem? Romero repeated this trope in Land of the Dead with an angry, vengeful zombie leading an army against a decadent, fortified human city. This development of sentience in zombies, who were usually portrayed as unthinking monsters, is particularly interesting, for while George Romero must get credit for brilliantly reinventing the zombie genre, he built upon foundations of thoughts and themes seen in other works. For starters, there's the Haitian lore and the Hollywood exploitations of that lore in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. But there's also other sources whose storytelling DNA permeate the zombie genre.
There is no phone ringing, damn it!
Let's start with Richard Matheson. As an author and screenwriter, Richard Matheson has had a significant influence on genre cinema. His post-apocalyptic novel I Am Legend follows the last man on Earth, Robert Neville, who battles a new species of ghoul. Matheson called these creations vampires, but they have far more in common with the zombies that followed in literature and cinema. This lone survivor narrative wasn't the first such story to come along. Similar themes have been explored in lots of tales, but Matheson's use of the so-called vampires to face off with hero Neville foreshadows zombie cinema, and it was a direct influence on Romero. Hell, even the sentience of the protagonist zombies in Day of the Dead and Land of the Dead are foreshadowed in Matheson's novel. In the end, Matheson brilliantly turns the table on the reader, revealing that his vampires are the new society, and Robert Neville, who has been hunting them for years, has become their legend, their monster, and by remaining a threat to them, he's preventing a new society from arising from the ashes of humanity. It is a brilliant ending, one no Hollywood adaptation has been brave enough to preserve.
You're freaks. I'm a man. The last man.
Good shot.
Despite the bleak ending to Night of the Living Dead and the slightly less bleak ending to Dawn of the Dead, they do both offer up hope of survival. Society is not as far gone as in I Am Legend. These post-apocalyptic survivor narratives lets filmmakers delve into interesting character work and ask interesting questions about humanity. Romero paved the way here, popularizing a new type of genre fiction, one that is reflected in most of contemporary zombie entertainment. But again, he wasn't first. Previous works explored similar topics. In John Wyndham's 1951 post-apocalyptic sci-fi novel, The Day of the Triffids, society collapses when a meteor shower turns all of humanity blind. Protagonist Bill Mason retains his sight, convalescing blindfolded in a hospital after having an accident where laboratory-grown killer plants called Triffids spray his face. He has never seen the meteors and thus retains his sight. When he wakes up, the new world of the blind is ripe for exploitation, and the Triffids take over, wiping out most of the human race. In the 1962 film adaptation, starring charming MGM musical star Howard Keel as Bill, the plot is condensed and simplified, with the Triffids arriving with the meteor, instead of being lab-grown. Still, the haunting narrative remains, with a small pocket of survivors fighting to endure a world overrun with killer plants. The Day of the Triffids is significant for the modern zombie genre, even though it is a film about killer plants. Partially, this is true because it foreshadows the most classic trope of the zombie genre, the lone enclave of survivors. But more directly, it is because of filmmaker Alex Garland. 28 Days Later sparked the current golden age of zombie horror, when it came out in 2002. Written by Garland and directed by Danny Boyle, 28 Days Later was a surprise hit, one that revitalized what zombies could be and how they could act. And like Night of the Living Dead, the zombies here aren't even called zombies. But of course they count as such, no matter the classification. When Garland started writing the script, he was directly influenced by The Day of the Triffids, a film he'd seen in his youth. The two movies start almost identically, and there are several other similarities, primarily in tone and theme. But most significantly is the survival narrative. This is perhaps the most recognized trope of modern zombie cinema. While the old lore of Haiti gave us movies where heroes fight against zombie masters commanding their dead slaves, the post-apocalypse of the new threat brings about a societal allegory where the collapse of civilization is the most notable event. This is vital in Romero's films and in Alex Garland's script, and it is vital in John Wyndham's Triffid story. Many of the most popular films in the zombie genre remain true to this trope. Sure, there are plenty of exceptions, like Wes Craven's The Serpent and the Rainbow, where the action is drawn back to Haiti, and the zombie is yet again a slave under a master's control. And then there are the Nazi zombies, where the spread of undead terror is localized, with only a small group afflicted, and the zombies acting more as allegories of warfare rather than societal collapse. But the majority of zombie cinema takes after the themes of Romero and The Day of the Triffids, featuring them either in a macro or microcosmos. We will look at both varieties. On the macro level, where all of civilization is afflicted, we have the worlds of Romero, where the entire globe is suffering zombie mayhem, and where the zombie takeover has already occurred, or is currently occurring. This includes the legacy of Richard Matheson, and in a more abstract way, of other sci-fi works like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where humanity has lost its place as the dominant species. Interestingly, George Romero wasn't the first to use zombies in the post-apocalypse. In 1962, British horror director and Hammer Films veteran Terence Fisher made The Earth Dies Screaming, a little and seldom seen film where a small enclave of people find that nearly everyone else has died. This little group of survivors figure out that some sort of gas attack has killed off the population, and that they were lucky enough to be spared by random chance. Soon the survivors run into robots of unknown origin, and said robots have the ability to raise the dead to do their bidding. This wasn't the first time the dead were raised by what we can presume to be aliens. Ed Wood had already done that in Plan 9 from Outer Space, and so had Edward L. Kahn in Invisible Invader. But here, in The Earth Dies Screaming, the dead are limitless, and though only a few are shown, there's no reason the robot enemy can't bring about a zombie apocalypse. Though the film's low budget and the 1-hour runtime prevent us from seeing a Romero-level cataclysm. As such, The Earth Dies Screaming remains a curiosity in film history, but a noteworthy one as a predecessor to Night of the Living Dead. The zombie as post-apocalypse would flourish again in the mid-1980s, but while a few zombie films outside of Romero took the globally apocalyptic approach on a macro level, most did not do that as of yet, keeping the outbreaks small and local, likely to save on the budget. until of course advances in filmmaking made the large, spectacular apocalypses easier to portray. Ironically, 28 Days Later, as a low-budget effort, led the way. Though the macro-apocalypse was synonymous with Romero, and when Zack Snyder remade George Romero's masterpiece, Dawn of the Dead, the Romero legacy was further solidified. The Dawn of the Dead remake doubled down on the Romero zombie and the Romero themes, so much so that the successful film overshadowed George Romero's own film Land of the Dead, which was released nearly at the same time.
Take car, go to Mum's, kill Phil, grab Liz, go to the Winchester, have a nice cold pint, and wait for all this to blow over.
Simon Pegg and Edgar Wright's screenplay for Shaun of the Dead further revitalized the zombie genre, and though mostly a cult success, the film was instrumental in cementing the Romero vision of zombies into contemporary culture. And then, of course, there was the TV series The Walking Dead, a long-running zombie soap opera based on the comic book series written by Robert Kirkman. And from here, it all flourished. Video games had several series, including Dead Rising and the already established Resident Evil franchises, the latter of which spawned a series of action horror films starring Milla Jovovich. We could enjoy a tongue-in-cheek apocalypse with funny takes like Zombieland. We got zombie Romeo and Juliet with warm bodies. We got zombies in classic literature with a Hollywood adaptation of Seth Grahame Smith's novel Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. And we got, of course, further political and societal analysis from Max Brooks's World War C, a novel that really should have been an HBO-style TV series rather than a feature film. Now, I actually enjoyed the film, but with the rich multi-perspective narratives of the novel, where each chapter was a different tale of survival and death, I think we lost out here. The zombie apocalypse was big, broad, and global. It was an allegory for disease, for war, for famine, for climate change, and for the folly of humanity. But what about the micro-level zombies? The cases where the zombie threat is contained. They are significant too, and if you actually do an accounting of zombie cinema, there are far more films with local outbreaks than there are with global ones. These micro-level zombie stories are just as vital, and they are something of a hybrid between the Romero zombie and the zombie tales of yore. Let's look at them, and let's start in 1972, with two films produced in Spain. Tombs of the Blind Dead feature Knights Templar rising from the grave, killing the living. The movie was directly inspired by Night of the Living Dead, but as director Armando de Osorio points out, these undead are not mindless zombies, but rather vengeful, cruel revenants rising for slaughter. In short, they have an agenda other than Still, I feel comfortable counting them as zombies. Being unthinking is not a criteria for zombies, as Romero and many others have shown.
Thought this might come in handy.
Oh, good idea.
The two of you together, that's fine. But what if one of you is the monster?
Monster? We're British, you know.
In Horror Express, Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, for once on the same side of a fight, must battle a zombie horde of passengers on the Orient Express. These zombies are unthinking, controlled by an alien that can jump from body to body, and is eager to do so after being stuck for millennia inside the frozen corpse of a missing link. The film, though goofy, is a blast, and it uses its contained location to the utmost, with a fun showdown inside the train. Spoiler alert, we even get a Kojak zombie. Spain wasn't the only country to benefit from the zombie craze Romero started. The Italians too wanted in, having a long tradition of adapting American genres, doing them Italian style. Hell, Dario Argento had a hand in financing Romero's Dawn of the Dead, in exchange for the Italian distribution rights. But lower budget filmmakers went after the zombies in a big way too. Most notorious is perhaps Zombie, also known as Zombie 2, directed by gore master Lucio Fulci. Why was it called Zombie 2? Because it was an unlicensed sequel to Dawn of the Dead, which had been released in Italy as Zombie. Zombie 2 was famous for underwater zombie versus shark fights, for gouging out the eyes of this unfortunate woman, and for being a so-called video nasty. Shot in the Dominican Republic and New York City, it thus keeps the Caribbean lore of the pre-Romero zombie genre, but it includes the ability of the zombies to infect and spread disease. Yet the gore was the most important part, along with the shots of the dead rising from the grave, covered in maggots and ready to consume flesh. Director Joe D'Amato would continue the Italian zombie rip-off tradition with Erotic Nights of the Living Dead, a hilariously bad take on the zombie, chock full of sex scenes. It was released in both hardcore and softcore versions. D'Amato, staring away from sexploitation and into pure pornography, would double down on zombie porn with Porno Holocaust, which features a woman raped by the living dead. It somehow manages to be an even worse zombie film than its predecessor. Zombie porn was meant to shock, entice, and attract an audience, but the idea of sex with a rotting corpse didn't seem to attract most audiences, and that's probably a good thing. However, the shock value of Nazi zombies certainly did attract attention. Several Nazi exploitation films had been made, usually ineptly, like They Saved Hitler's Brain and Gestapo's Last Orgy, but zombies breathed life, so to speak, into the Nazi exploitation genre. First up, outside of 1941's vague reference to Nazis in King of the Zombies, was 1966's The Frozen Dead. In Shockwaves, Peter Cushing plays a former SS commandant up to no good. The film features a few interesting moments of uniformed corpses rising from swamp water, but it's no classic. The same can be said for later Nazi zombie films like Oasis of the Zombies. They don't tap into the ideas that make zombies such vital monsters, instead simply using them for lurid kills. The deeper thoughts and allegories that zombies crossed with Nazis represent simply aren't present in most Nazi exploitation zombie films, probably because the films are more interested in the spectacle of the concept. That would change with Norwegian filmmaker Tommy Wirkola, who used Nazi zombies in Dead Snow for gory carnage and delightfully absurd humor. Dead Snow is far less interested in the social critique of George Romero and those that followed in Romero's wake, and far more interested in loony fun. It is, in my opinion, the finest of the Nazi zombie genre, even as additional solid and strong entries like Overlord have followed in recent years. Wirkola is far from the first to stare into zaniness when it comes to zombies. Peter Jackson, before him, did the same in the low-budget New Zealand film Braindead, released in the US as Dead Alive. The zombie is an easy enemy to slay, representing in that film the nebbish hero's fight to stand up for himself against those that constantly pick on him, like his mother, who becomes the most terrible zombie of them all. If you've seen the film, you'll know what I mean. While Braindead veers from Romero's genre conventions, it remains a zombie film, and there are several other zombie films that are on their own path. Chief among them is Stuart Gordon's Re-Animator. Here, in this film, Herbert West reanimates people, only to have them come back as wild, insane versions of themselves. These are not shambling, unthinking enemies, but rather revenants with a capacity for thought and, if not reason, then certainly cunning. Are these reanimated corpses then zombies? Can we classify them as such? I think so, but I have a policy of inclusivity of genre. The world is so much more interesting when we allow for broad variety within a field. To give some examples of this, is King Kong horror? Yes, because it was considered horror back when it came out. Is Wolfen a werewolf film, even if it doesn't feature any actual werewolves? Hell yes, because it retains the spirit of werewolf cinema and is linked by lore and mythology. And is Re-Animator a zombie film? Absolutely. But is Frankenstein and the Mummy zombies? Oh boy. I'm going to answer no, because they have their own distinct origins that are separate from the zombie. As you can tell, this isn't an exact science, and thank heaven for it, because genre blending makes cinema a fun art to behold and discuss and obsess over. And here's where the zombie genre, as first established from Haitian lore, and then recontextualized by George Romero, becomes so damn fascinating. Zombies are allegories, and they work in many different ways. They are specters of the slave trade, capturing the trauma of an entire people. They are revenants rising from the grave but retaining free will. They are locusts consuming us in swarms. They are disease vectors standing in for how dangerous viruses spread throughout humanity. They are enemies to gleefully slaughter in slapstick worlds of blood and gore. They are allegories for past sins come back to haunt us. And they are new possible permutations of humanity. This last idea brings up a question. What is the future of zombie cinema? Has zombie cinema oversaturated the market? Have the zombies jumped the shark or nuked the fridge? Pick your allegory. George Romero's take on the zombie has been wildly influential for over 50 years, and in the past 20, it has been particularly dominant. Perhaps it is just me, but I feel like the genre has begun to fade. After 50 odd years, who can blame it? But if I were to guess, something will come around and reignite the craze, be it a resurrection of the tropes George Romero gave us, or of the zombie lore that preceded him, or a different take on the monster, one that takes the genre in a brand new direction. Either way, of one thing I remain certain, the zombie will rise again, and it will reign as a king among monsters for ages to come. My name is Wolfcraft, this is History of Horror. If you enjoyed the episode, I'd sure appreciate it if you liked, shared, and subscribed. Thanks aplenty.